Good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Rishi Sunak attempts to unify competing visions. Good morning. You're watching Sky News Breakfast. Rishi Sunak attempts to unify competing visions for the Conservatives ahead of a general election as party conference begins in Manchester today. Two men are arrested after Bradley Lowry, a young football fan who died of cancer, was mocked at a match. NATO gets its first pro-Putin, anti-America leader after Slovakia returns leftist politician Robert Fico to power in parliamentary elections. The United States government narrowly avoids shutdown after both Republicans and Democrats agree to a short-term funding deal. Taking single-use plastics off the menu, a ban comes into force in England to cut down on waste. Well, in a moment, we'll discuss the papers with broadcaster and psychotherapist Lucy Beresford and anthropologist Mary Ann Ohota. But first, let's take you through the front pages. Well, starting with the Sunday Express, which reports that among the measures to be unveiled at this week's Conservative Party conference will be a financial aid package of more than £1 billion aimed at reviving Britain's run-down high streets. The Sunday Times hears that the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, wants Rishi Sunak to quit the European Convention on Human Rights. The Mail on Sunday quotes the Home Secretary criticising celebrities such as Sir Elton John, who've expressed their views on the government's migration policies. According to the Observer, the Department for Education is keeping secret files concerning the social media activity of critics of its policies. The Sunday Telegraph reveals that Defence Secretary Grant Shapps is discussing the possibility of deploying British troops to Ukraine for the first time. The Sunday People carries tributes to teenage stabbing victim Eliane Andam, focusing particularly on her love of dancing. The Sunday Mirror has a special report on Somalia's forgotten children, as 1.5 million of them are reported to be facing extreme hunger as the nation is gripped by its worst ever drought. Socks Maniac is the headline in the Daily Star Sunday. They report an England star gets his tackle out for romp but refuses to take off his not very romantic ankle warmers. Good God. And The Sun leads with the news that Downton Abbey star Hugh Bonneville has split from his wife of 25 years. With us this morning to review the papers are anthropologist Mary Ann Ohota and broadcaster and psychotherapist Lucy Beresford. Good to have you in the studio with us. As you can tell, I wasn't expecting that front page.
No, it's one we haven't chosen.
Clearly an aphrodisiac. Next time. Thank you for that. Okay, we'll start with the Times. The front page talking about Kemi Badenoch piling on the pressure to quit on Rishi Sunak. They're already at it.
Well, they're already at it. I mean, the kind of the House of Cards games begin. Obviously, the Conservative Party conference begins today in Manchester. So there's certain, there's a kind of a lining up of potential leadership threats to Rishi Sunak. And Kemi Badenoch is kind of putting her stakes on this idea that plays very well with the kind of, I guess, the right side of the Conservative Party, that perhaps leaving the European Convention on Human Rights should be on the table. So she's very diplomatic.
This keeps
she's
coming
not
up,
an idiot.
and she's picked it up, right?
She's picked it up because it plays well. It feeds into the kind of the fear-mongering around the migrant crisis, around control of our borders, without using any of that language. So this is around the basis of, if the European Court of Human Rights were to block deportations of asylum seekers to Rwanda, then maybe we should just leave, because that's a way of dealing with international laws that don't, suit us. So it's and it's in a whole mass of other announcements that or kind of intentional strategic leaks about what is and isn't on the cards, when the next general election might be called, whether that's tied to inflation, whether at the point that the UK hit less than 3% inflation, Rishi Sunak will go, okay, now's the time to pull the trigger, we're going to have a general election because that makes me look competent. We wait and see what else comes out of
party conference this week. It will be there. Lucy, let's pick up the front page of the Telegraph, talking about Grant Shapps saying he's going to send UK troops to Ukraine for training, of course. So.
Yes, again, I think that you can read this story in two ways. It's a factual story about Grant Shapps making an announcement that, in fact, what he would like to see is perhaps some British troops not just training Ukraine soldiers here in this country at the various training grounds, but also perhaps going what's called in-country, perhaps to the west of the country, to be able to support the Ukrainian troops, which takes our involvement to a whole new level.
Yes.
But what he's also talking about is maybe companies also going in there, like British Aerospace or BAE. But of course, as a story, it's also putting Grant Shapps front and centre of another dimension to the Conservative brand, if you like, which is, defence. And because his predecessor, Ben Wallace, was so synonymous with, in a way, the Ukraine war and Britain's commitment to that country, you can also read this as yet another opportunity for someone to say, oh, but I've also got some great ideas and I can also appeal to a particular faction within the Conservative Party. So it's a really interesting story from a military point of view, because it would increase our involvement, and we have always said that we didn't want to have boots on the ground because it might inflame relations. Inflame relations with Russia in the sense that they could turn around and say, well, no, the UK is really now in our war, as opposed to us just sending military hardware. But I think it also comes at a very interesting time for a couple of other countries in Europe who have perhaps been getting war fatigue. We know that Poland, for example, is in a dispute with Ukraine over shipments of grain. Poland feels that their farmers are being flooded with grain from Ukraine. So the coalition that existed right at the beginning, which was very pro-Ukraine, is perhaps showing signs of fracturing. And this might be Grant Shapps' way of saying, no, we are going to hold not just the UK feet to the fire, we're going to hold the European feet to the fire in support of Ukraine.
It'll be interesting to see Russia's response, which I'm sure we'll get later in the day from the Kremlin.
Yeah, because it wasn't that many months ago that there was the whole conversation was, if there was even a bullet that strayed over the border from Poland, then does that commit the whole of NATO into what would effectively be then World War III? And it's kind of how times have changed that it's now Grant Shapps making a positive announcement.
Well, I think it feeds into your story about Kemi Badenoch. It's about how do, particularly this week of the Conservative Party conference, how do Conservative MPs show that they're being incredibly assertive, incredibly they're having policies that are very self-contained and saying this is what I would stand for, this is what my position would be in particular situations, because it isn't just about the Conservative conference, it's about what happens over the next 12 months.
Yes.
And if Conservatives lose the next general election, who then replaces Rishi Sunak?
We've got to move for...
Oh, I was going to say, well, the kind of the linking factor with these two stories, these two kind of positions, is that they are externally focused, that the threat is out there and we are doing something over there in a different nation state or a different sovereign territory. And fundamentally, I mean, you don't have to be the world's greatest cynic to know that's because things aren't going well at home.
Yeah, very good point for our viewers to take note of when they look at these headlines.
I would argue that actually defence of the realm is a government's first line of support for the nation. Everything else is important, cost of living, NHS, trains, whatever it might be, but actually defending the country from anything, whether that's a perceived threat or a real threat, is actually really important psychologically.
A lot of angles and perspective. Yeah, exactly. Take it any which way. Okay, let's move on to the Mirror and this really sad and devastating front page. And, we talk about donor fatigue and people seeing these pictures over and over again, but This is really horrific. The baby who can't cry.
Yeah, so this is a picture of a little girl who lives in Somalia, Nasro. She's 2 years old. She weighs about a stone. That's a bit, you know.
I thought she was a newborn when I saw the picture. To learn
I
that she's
thought she was a newborn, actually.
That she's a toddler that's what makes it so shocking.
It's shocking.
She's so malnourished.
And I think it's a courageous move for the Mirror to make, to run this as a front page story, and also to kind of spread it across the inside pages to say, this is what we're talking about when we talk about net zero commitments, when we talk about tackling climate change. These aren't abstract bureaucratic pieces of paperwork that technocrats kind of can fiddle about with the details, or we can say, look, we are doing our share and we can't bankrupt ourselves. This is the human face of climate change, and that in Somalia, I think it's estimated that 43,000 people have died last year because of the drought. Now, Somalia, people might say, well, that always happens in the Horn of Africa. This isn't a new news story. This is climate change. But the thing you always have to remember is that it's the perfect storm of conditions where climate change fuels social conflict and political unrest and movement of people within territories. And so you can't disentangle the people moving because there is more conflict, because there is greater political instability, because there is more threat to their livelihoods and lives. Yeah. And this is the reality. A little girl who is so dehydrated she can no longer cry.
It's just utterly horrific.
So while we're all eating our breakfast, let's reflect on that.
I know, absolutely. 4 million people facing crisis levels of
migration in Africa is actually where the main focus of migration is going to go over the next 10 years. We've been very used to people coming from war-torn countries like Syria or maybe Afghanistan, but actually now what we're seeing is a massive migration from Africa.
Climate having the impact.
Climate and political instability.
Very briefly, we look at the Independent. Lucy, Tories headed for election wipeout, says Pastor.
Yes, so John Curtis, the polling guru, has been. He's going to be speaking at the Conservative Party conference today, and he's looking at quite a lot of the polling figures, which of course are only ever a snapshot of where you are right now. But what he's saying is, it's the general narrative doesn't look good for the Conservatives. They have not been at the top of a poll for nearly, probably getting on for 2 years. I think it was in December 2021, the Conservatives were last in the lead. So he's really drawing attention to the fact that irrespective of how you want to spin your various polls, and there is so much polling in the various papers today, that actually the broad narrative, and of course politics is all about narrative, it's all about the stories that we tell ourselves and each other about ourselves and our place in the world, that actually unless the Tories really pay attention to the different areas of polling, what are people saying about economic competency? What are people saying about the cost of living crisis? Because that's probably where it's going to be. And so John Curtis is saying it's all very well for you highlighting particular wedge issues, and we can speak to some of those issues that we've talked about already, but actually the general thrust is that people are going to be concerned with the money that they have in their pocket, that the cost of living crisis is going to trump everything.
We have run out of time. We're going to have to leave it there, but we have you back in the next hour to talk more about all of this. Marianne and Lucy, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.